Hey readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and you're listening to Fictitious, a podcast about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. I'm joined this episode by Clay McLeod Chapman, author of the meta-horror thriller The Remaking. The tragic campfire tale of a mother and daughter burned as witches haunts the imagination of a small town. When child actress Amber Pendleton is cast in a 70s B-movie about the urban legend, it seems like a springboard to Hollywood. Instead, the traumatic events surrounding the film follow her into a medication-saturated 1990s adulthood. She makes her living at third-rate horror conventions, signing photographs for too eager fans who cannot separate Amber from her disastrous childhood. But when the story that destroyed her life comes calling, again and again, does Amber have any choice but to play a new, desperate part each time? The Remaking follows the backwoods ghost story from 70s horror flick to 90s auteur remake to modern-day true crime podcast, each time asking, why do these tales consume us, and do we really care about the lives they ruin for our entertainment? The Remaking arrives in stores on October 8th from Quirk Books. And Clay, welcome to Fictitious.
Thanks for having me. Man, I love that intro. I'd love to read that book.
I think it's pretty accurate. Certainly, this is a novel that is a little hard to sum up because it covers several different eras and it does have sort of a meta nature to it, in the sense that it is both a story and a reflection on the way that we experience stories and tell stories, and to a certain extent, I would say even exploit story and people's stories. Yeah. We had a conversation at Comic-Con this past summer about the story, and it was one of my first times running into it, and I was immediately like, okay, this is something I need to read because this hits a lot of buttons for me. But something I'm really, really struck with in this story is how much I feel like there's a commentary at work here about the nature of pop culture and its obsessions and the way fandom touches on stories and the people who create them. So as we dive into this craft of your whole construction of this story, I really want to talk about how you built it, but a lot about intention and what you were trying to communicate with it as well. So outside of that very, very wordy opener, how else would you pitch or explain this story?
Oh, man. If I had an elevator ride, my kind of quick pitch is that it's a ghost story that is told 4 different ways. It's a campfire tale that reinvents itself every 20 so years, that you have the kind of true crime element of this actual event that happened at the turn of last century. And that kind of ripples out into something more urban legendy that then becomes something more cinematic, which then becomes remade, which then becomes so on and so forth. And it is the snake kind of devouring its own tail.
Which is appropriate considering the cover art.
Yeah.
Which there's a really fancy Latin word to describe that. It's like
Ouroboros. Ouroboros. That's what it is.
Yes, that's the one. Yeah.
Not the Northern Lights, but Ouroboros.
Right, yeah. And I think that it's one of those covers that thematically you can kind of get as you go along, but I think there's even a paragraph in the story where you can see oh, that's where it's from. It's right from this one particular passage in there. And you touched on something there too that I think kind of explains a little bit of the significance of the title, which is that The Remaking really does kind of lampshade the fact that this is a story that's being told in a couple of different eras, in a couple of different media, or I should say a few different media by different people. And so in an era where, to contextualize this, a couple of hours before recording this interview, at the time of this interview, Twitter was blowing up with talk of NBC's new streaming service where they're going to do a remake of Battlestar Galactica and Saved by the Bell and Punky Brewster and a bunch of other things. And I was literally had this book in hand while seeing that stuff. And I was like, while this book deals with horror tropes and that being a big part of sort of horror movie culture, it is so a part of our pop culture in general, that need to remake stories and retread and take something that people already have some passing familiarity with. So, I mean, can you kind of tell me where this particular one came from? I can see the building blocks there, but where did this idea spawn from and how did it kind of evolve?
I mean, quite honestly, it started with The Ring. with Ringu. I remember watching that film kind of prior to knowing much about it. I mean, I kind of fortunately stumbled upon it at the video store. And I guess it was like what Tartan Video Extreme had come out with these DVD releases of these J-horror films before J-horror was really, before it kind of put its stamp on the kind of American cultural conscience. I remember finding it, not knowing much about it, kind of reading the back cover of it and thinking that this sounded really interesting, and watching it and just being profoundly affected by it. And then, of course, Gore Verbinski does his remake, a few years later. And I loved the remake as well for its own kind of reasons. But it just started this kind of conversation in my head about this idea of like, let's just kind of go off of the basic premise that, Sadako from the original Ringu was in fact a true ghost story, that was something that happened in Japan. And how would Sadako feel? Not only does her story become a movie in Japan, but then it evolves into all these various permutations. Like, I mean, there are sequels in Japan. I think there's some in even Korean versions of the film. There's American version. And I just kind of asked that very simple question of like, man, how would she feel about all this? Like they've kind of taken her story and just run with it. And, how much of it got lost in translation with the American remake. And when the J-horror craze really took over, I was just kind of amazed at the cultural rinsing of what made those original stories so kind of potent. I think particular, was it Pulse, which was remade. At one point, I think Wes Craven was even involved. I think he even gets like screenwriting credit for it. But, it was a very watered down version of the original. And it just surprised me and kind of struck me that what made the original versions of this, the J-horror versions of it, so potent was the kind of cultural references, or the things that kind of rooted it to its region as opposed to anything else. And how a lot of that got either taken out or just watered down or lost in the translation. It made me ask the question, like, could Sadako cross the ocean and come to America? Like how far, what's the reach of a ghost when her story gets, stretched over to another continent and, someone else starts to tell her story? That became this kind of long gestating question that I had no answer to or no story to beyond the kind of what if of it. And one thing led to another, and I had a lunch meeting with an editor at Quirk Books. And I remember not pitching that, but kind of a very different version of it, because I didn't want to take a story that originated in Japan and try to translate it to an American audience, because I didn't feel like I had claim to that. I didn't have ownership over that, culturally speaking. So I started to ask the question of like, would our American stories, our own kind of national ghost stories or urban legends that root from there? And when I first started kind of pitching the idea to Quirk, it kind of rooted itself more in a kind of Friday the 13th, Jason Voorhees, the boy who drowned in the lake, kind of a slasher version of it, I guess you could say. Quirk, my editor, God bless her, she was like, that's interesting, but I don't know. Like she was kind of aware of the kind of limitations or the kind of familiarity of that story. I mean, we're very kind of steeped in Friday the 13th here, and it seemed to close the doors as opposed to kind of pull them open further. So we kind of came to an understanding of like what was the kind of potency of this story. And it was the kind of that ripple effect, that echo of a story that travels over decades, over generations, over different mediums. And it allowed me a chance to kind of go back to that original question with The Ring. And we came to an agreement that we would search through the kind of urban legends that were not fictitious, not necessarily movies like Friday the 13th, but like look to the lore, look to the folklore of our own regions. And lo and behold, it got us to the little witch girl of Pilot's Knob in Kentucky. That was the tipping point for me. It all started with her.
So you do have a real life, and I always think that the term urban legend is funny because it mostly stems from non-urban areas.
Yeah.
They always come from small towns, little tucked away places, corners of the world that haven't aged in, 20 years or whatever, or have aged incredibly but not changed. And I mean, I come from a small town, so we have, all of our own versions of those things as well. So there's definitely that familiarity, but we know, like, especially like the 70s and 80s horror films are like littered with like explorations of that idea of the little urban legend, that little creepy story. And in particular in some of the winking at the camera things in the 90s where they started to extrapolate on those ideas, most notably in Scream,
yes,
I think. And certainly that commentary is alive here as well. So some of this is a little difficult to talk about because I don't want to get spoilery on, on the show, but it's part of the pitch of the book that this story takes place in 4 different time periods, even 5 if you count where the story comes from, because the actual genesis of the original ghost story is on events that take place, I think, in like the early 1900s, and then there's sort of a campfire story that's in the 1950s, and then there's a B movie getting made in the 70s. Then we jump forward into the 90s to a remake and that actress being pulled back into this thing again. And then we leap forward into more like present day where we've got a true crime podcast, so very in the zeitgeist there. We're not giving anything away when we explain that because that is literally kind of the pitch of the story. From the standpoint of making a story that is about story, it is about the meta nature of horror storytelling and these kind of like, ghost story things. Horror has always had kind of like these winking elements. There is a lot of like fan service, especially at the more the genre matured. And we see this now. I think it's all over in media, but I feel like horror was one of the first genres to be like, oh, we're going to remake a movie and then we're going to pull in a previous actor because we know the audience wants that. That's the fan service element. That's what we're giving them. And now we see that all over the place in shows where it's like, oh, we had Smallville where we took the original Lana Lang and we made her Clark's mom and stuff like that, where like there's a lot of shows where they're bringing in people from earlier renditions of these shows. But I think horror kind of did that first. And somebody will probably point out that I'm totally wrong about that, but that was my own perception of it,
No, I agree.
And I think you're definitely playing with some of that stuff here. So in thinking about how that works in the story, what were you looking at as far as kind of the source material and figuring out like how to use those tropes, those familiar elements, and the stuff that infects the culture of horror fandom alongside the actual movies and properties?
For me, like I've always been enamored with the kind of campfire story. It's been always really important to me. I mean, I'm coming from a kind of quasi theatrical background, and something about the engagement between the audience and the performer, the content, the story, whatever you want to call the kind of the artifact itself, whether that's a film, a performance, a band. There's something to be said about a piece of art that kind of engages with its audience. And I really wanted to be kind of mindful of that in writing this book. And I think first person narrative is another kind of, it's a gesture towards kind of bringing the reader a little bit closer into the experience, at least for me, in my mind. To your question, the campfire story, I wanted to look at how has a campfire ghost story kind of evolved over time. And I think film in of itself is its own kind of version of that, kind of like going back to caveman days, like let's talk about today's kill, and like, drawing the paintings on the wall. Like it's all one singular thread that has just kind of evolved or mutated, or it's just grown. The medium kind of changes, but at its heart, there's got to be an audience. The audience it's integral to kind of taking in the content. You can't have one without the other. So I think that relationship has always been very, very important. So in writing the remaking, I just wanted to be kind of mindful of what is the kind of the vehicle for these ghost stories. So in the 50s, to me, it was sitting around that campfire and, spinning a yarn. And then when you get to the 70s, like I had to pick my personal fave, one of my personal faves of that genre or that decade, which is Let's Scare Jessica to Death, which is a beautiful, beautiful movie if you've never seen it. And I pay complete lip service to it in the remaking. And then you get to the 90s and, I think film it's becoming very aware of itself in new kind of interesting ways, particularly within the horror genre, thanks to Kevin Williamson and Wes Craven. And then, you get to our modern times and podcasts are taking off. And it seemed like a very kind of a new injection of the campfire story, because there's something so intimate about putting on a pair of headphones and listening to these voices that feel as if they're in the room with you. Like I feel like podcasts are beautiful because you could almost close your eyes and believe or imagine that it's just two people in a room kind of talking or chatting with one another. And I feel like that is an amazing place to tell a ghost story. And I think some of the best podcasts are ghost stories.
We're talking about the different eras that this takes place in, and you're talking about the audience interaction with something. And it made me think of a conversation I had a few episodes back with Alex E. Harrow, who has a book called The 10,000 Doors of January, and her novel takes place at the beginning of the 1900s. And one of the things I wondered about reading it was that I, as a 40-something-year-old person, have some inkling of what that time period was, entirely informed by media and very little informed by education. So most of it's probably wrong, but I sort of have an immediate picture that comes to mind, right? Mm-hmm. If you've got an audience that's reading some of these things that are maybe in their 20s or something, they're that much further away from those time periods. What do they remember of it? Do they have an inkling of what the 50s looked like? Do they know what the 70s were outside of maybe watching that 70s show on reruns somewhere, right? So I think a lot about now in constructing stories that have some sort of period piece is how much you can rely on the audience to bring to the table and how much you need to give them. And in this particular story, you're dealing with several different eras and sort of almost like brief, it's almost like 4 novellas that are connected together in this. Basically, when you're doing the world building there, how do you know how much information to give them so that they understand the time and place and the differences between now? How do you judiciously choose what those things are, and how much are you depending on the audience to bring to the table?
I do think it was a bit of a dial adjustment. I would say that in terms of the kind of each separate section, like I wanted each to kind of feel of the era. When I was writing the 90s section, I wanted it to make it feel like it was Scream. Like I wanted, I wrote the 70s version as if it were, Let's Scare Jessica to Death. Or, they had a certain kind of ambiance or a kind of tonality to them that was more in the 70s. Like I just thought of like everything just had to feel like very saturated and kind of grainy and gritty. In the 90s section, I wanted it to feel very kind of pristine and kind of sleek and polished. And the aughts section, I don't even know, how do you even say that? It's 2016, so is that post-aughts or teens again? That section, I wanted it to feel very prismatic. You're getting these kind of soundbite sections. And then, the part 1, the first section, I just wanted it to feel like a very kind of linear ghost story. It starts off very kind of succinctly with like, come sit around the campfire with me. I'm going to spin a yarn. I just wanted to treat them as if they had an essence of it without feeling like I was getting kind of completely lost in kind of the immersion of the era. There are references to bell bottoms and hairstyles, but for the most part, to me, it was kind of a spiritual connection to the era, as opposed to like focusing on what cars were being driven.
There's something when you talk about like the, like the slick 90s versus the dirt of the 70s and stuff like that. I mean, each of these eras, outside of that initial campfire story element, the rest of the story really flows along following this character named Amber Pendleton. Mm-hmm. She's a child actress who appears in that 70s movie. Things go entirely awry, as you would expect. And then we follow this journey with her afterwards. And I think, we see parallels in other pop culture as far as if you think about like the Scream movies, talk about how like the Neve Campbell character, Sydney, how she changes over time over the course of those movies. Or if we see, oh my gosh, I can't think of her name, but she's in the Halloween films.
Jamie Lee Curtis.
Jamie Lee Curtis, yes. Somebody who has now played that character multiple iterations over decades of time, and each one sort of visiting that character in a new light and examining what it means at their age and experience. In this one with Amber, we're seeing somebody who has been massively traumatized by these experiences and yet is revered by a certain kind of fan, a certain type of person who encountered her work as a child at a formative moment in their life, where it rings with them afterwards. And there's a section where we see her meeting the director of the 90s film and realizing that he's a fan and realizing that he has a story, and that story is his first interaction with an image of her and then the film that she was in. And her realizing that, like, okay, this is his particular truth, but it's one that is so repetitive because she's encountered it over and over and over again. Because when she goes to these signings where she's making her income, which is showing up at fan conventions, and similar to what we have now, but in the smaller, grimier 90s version of them, pre-internet, and having all these people that, like, she matters intensely to, but maybe for all the wrong reasons, and who every time they see her, they are still seeing a 10-year-old creepy child from a horror movie, not a strung out early 30s something who's barely keeping her life together. And I thought there was a lot of commentary happening both on the nature of a person who's gone through this stuff and who is living under this, like, illusion of what their life is, and then a look at fandom itself and how it interacts with people who have, been a part of these things, and what we put on them and what we expect back from them.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, like, what was your thinking as you were putting that together? What were the building blocks of that aspect of the story?
It always went back to this one particular question, and it's who has the right to tell these stories? And that is a very direct question that is asked about the creators, the artists, the filmmakers that Amber encounters within each section, but also to the extent that you're talking about with the fans at these conventions and kind of fandom in general. We all have these stories. Like, I am a fan. I grew up in this era where, as an adult now, kind of working around or in this industry, I really have to be careful, because I realize that, if I'm on set for a film I've worked on, I react as a fan first. And it's hard to put that down. Like, I cannot keep my cool. It has led to many kind of embarrassing kind of faceplant moments. But, like, if I'm in a room with somebody and I remember very vividly the first time that I experienced watching the movie that they starred in 20, 30 years ago, and, I'm one of many. For me, it's always boiling down to kind of like, what would Barbara Crampton do in a scenario like this? Or what would Jamie Lee Curtis do? You mentioned Jamie Lee at the beginning of the question, and it was just such fortuitous timing, because I was writing this novel as David Gordon Green was directing, and, they were putting together the upteenth version of Halloween. And I was just amazed by the stamina and the evolution of the character that Jamie Lee Curtis has played, and all the various permutations from part 1 to part 2 to part 8 to then back to part 2, I guess you could say, it's a sequel to the original while disregarding the subsequent sequels. You almost can see this heroine as a kind of an interesting kind of time capsule of this character. Like, all the films present these different versions of this one character. And, I partook in the kind of reading of people responding to that idea of, like, oh, I really liked part 2, or, oh, I wish, like, why did they have to disregard part 4 or 5? There is a certain kind of ownership of these films because they're so valuable to us as viewers. Like, I hold in high regard Halloween and Alien and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And, if I'm in a position to kind of meet these people who partook in making these films, either enacting them or writing them or directing them, I'm telling them the story, the impact of their film on my life. And if you multiply that by however many umpteen thousand viewers, that takes a level of endurance and compassion and understanding that I feel like only the savviest artists have mastered. My hat is off to anybody who can smile and say, thank you very much for telling me that story. Because the relationship between fan and artist is so personal. And I do think within the horror genre in particular, it's very, very personal. It is for me. I know that for a fact. I remember the first time that I saw Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Friday the 13th, and the intimate experience of watching these movies as a child and the kind of subsequent trauma that has kind of left its imprint. Like, there's something there. And, I think with the remaking, it's not so much that I'm making a comment on it, but just asking the question. I want to be clear about that. Like, I'm asking this question, like, who owns these stories? Is it Amber just because she played this part? Is it the filmmaker because they wrote a script and directed the movie? Or is it the ghost that the story is based on? Or is it the person who watches it because they had an intimate kind of personal experience with it? And I don't think I answer the question. I don't want to, but I at least want to kind of pose it and throw it out there as a way in which to kind of explore the various kind of interactions between audience and story.
I think there feels like there's also a certain look at the idea of how male creatives can sort of take hold or hijack the stories of women and their trauma as well. And I know that gets complicated because you are a male author, writing about this idea as well.
Yeah.
But it feels very careful within the narrative about that. But because you have a director in the 70s, a film director, who remaking this thing in the 90s, and then this guy who's doing this podcast in the aughts, the teens, the whatever, like, again, I don't know what the hell to call it either. And each one of them, I think, is they all have this compulsion, like, I'm going to tell the story. I was born to tell this story. I'm the one who is out here to finally do it justice. And all of them, I think, go into it with the best of intentions, but their own obsession with it causes a lot of problems as well. And then, like you said, is it Amber's story as somebody who has gone through extreme trauma and is brought back to it again and again anyway, somewhat willingly, somewhat unwillingly. It almost feels like a bit of inevitability for her in a lot of ways. And of course, the story, I mean, even in her own narrative, she's not necessarily a reliable narrator because she's basically medicated out of her mind for, chunks of the story. But I mean, is that part of the commentary you were looking at there? I mean, is that in the text, or am I reading something more layered on?
No, it's there. And I am not off the hook. I have to kind of acknowledge that I'm one of those auteurs. Like, this question of like these male filmmakers who are coming in and basically kind of claiming ownership of this story. I'm right there. And like, I have to acknowledge that. Like, I can't let myself off of the hook for it. And, it has to be kind of like baked into the book itself. So like, if there's a part 2, maybe it'll be even further meta of like the novelist who wrote the remake. Suddenly, like, the savvy reader should ask that question of like, wait a minute, wasn't this book written by a dude? And like, here are these other dudes. Like, yes, like that's there. Like it has to be. I myself am asking that question of myself. Do I have the right to tell this story? Well, I did. And now am I going to suffer the consequences for it? Well, we'll see. Ella Louise and Jessica, the ghost of Jessica has not come knocking on my door quite yet. But what you said about Amber and this kind of the notion of the unreliable narrator, like that was really important to me. Like for better or for worse, I am so enamored with Edgar Allan Poe and his unreliable narrator. There's just the notion of like Telltale Heart or Black Cat, that like you have this idea of who is the person who is telling this story, and are they in fact the right person to tell this story? And it's just by sheer default that they are our narrator, that they have been given the responsibility or assigned the task of telling the tale, that Amber, I don't know if you should trust Amber. I mean, the book goes out of its way to kind of pinpoint like all of the trauma that she's been through. But yet, you get to section 3, part 3, the story goes from her perspective, her point of view. And that comes with a lot of literary and cinematic pedigree. Like, I mean, what's amazing is that if you think of like short stories like The Yellow Wallpaper or, even The Haunting of Hill House. In film terms, something like The Haunting or Carrie or Rosemary's Baby. Like there's always been this notion of the air quote hysterical woman. It is a cinematic trope, particularly with horror films. It is a part of the genre, for better or for worse. I wanted to kind of give that a moment of kind of putting it under the lens and exploring it. There's something to be said about like, is she crazy or is she really being haunted? And like, what gives us the right to even think that she's crazy? And rather than kind of dismissing her as being insane, like that's something that just goes back for decades with these films and these stories that I wanted to explore it.
There's something we said there for the fact that when we often look at people who are unstable or having some sort of mental illness, we tend to not think about our own participation in their trauma. And I think this story does address that. I mean, when we see Amber through several stages of her life, through her own perspective and otherwise, and I want to touch on that as far as the POV structure of this in a second. But we do really get a feel like when we meet the fans, they're all like, they all want something from her. They want to express adulation, but they also don't understand that they're not treating her like a human being, and they're not seeing her for who she is. There's a lot of commentary from Amber about people looking right through her or seeing a face that's 20 years younger. They're projecting a lot on her. And that takes its toll on her in a heavy way. And she doesn't necessarily handle those things in a healthy fashion, but she's never been given a healthy fashion to do it with. And we kind of get that sense from her mother to directors to her psychologists or whatever, that she's never been given the tools to do this in a way that is actually functional. And again, I thought that was good commentary. Like I said, the POVs in this book are a little different. And structurally, this is something that I think that some people might find a little bit of a challenge, in the sense that I think like that each section is narratively built a little differently. And like you said, it's there for a reason as far as setting the tone and the era. And I think something you said earlier, as far as like in first person, it draws us closer. In a third person, we get a little bit more of an outsider's view. And I think we innately trust third person narration as truth versus a narrator where we feel closer to it, but we can't necessarily trust their viewpoint. What was your thinking behind that change and shift between each one of the sections?
With third person, the second section, part 2, where Amber is 9 years old and she's first cast in the role of Jessica Ford as a child, I wanted to get a little bit of distance from her perspective and kind of have an opportunity to write from the third person, but still kind of entrench it in her perspective a little bit. But, the camera kind of recedes just a little bit further back. So you're not necessarily in the kind of shoes of a 9-year-old as much as just kind of looking at the world shoulder to shoulder with her. Just the ability to marvel at the experience of being on set. I think of like, what happened to baby Jane? And this idea of a story that shows the kind of inherent traumas within the industry in a pre-code, pre-law version of like how Child Protective Services wasn't necessarily kind of on set for a lot of these kind of early films. You think of like Linda Blair from The Exorcist, and the kind of experiences that she went through at the hands of a visionary megalomaniac. Here's a character, we can't see Linda Blair today without associating her with The Exorcist. And in my mind, that is a terrifying notion. I have never talked to Linda Blair. I've only read copious amounts of interviews, but I have to imagine that, like, what day is it that she will reach a point where she either doesn't think about The Exorcist or somebody else doesn't make her think about The Exorcist?
It's funny you should say that, because earlier this year I was speaking at a convention and Linda Blair was there. I ended up being backstage with her.
Oh, wow.
I didn't actually have a conversation with her, but I was basically shoulder to shoulder with her for a section while I was there with another group. And she did a little mini interview while she was there, and she had been on stage for had a dedicated hour to her. And I was struck by that thing where I was like, here's somebody who's at least 10 or 15 years older than I am. And yet my understanding of her, my vision of her is that child from that film, from The Exorcist, and, the iconic nature of that. And I was struck by the fact that she went up on stage and answered questions about those things, but then she used her platform up there for activism, humanitarianism. She was very passionate about those things. Even in the moment, I thought, I was like, okay, people come here because they want to see the little girl from The Exorcist, who's now like 60. And she's like, cool, that's what I did, but let me talk about what's real now.
Yeah.
And I thought that was, in a lot of ways, I mean, it's going to sound silly, but kind of a brave thing to go up there and be like, yeah, like, you know me for this thing I did 40 years ago, but I've got something else to say. And I thought that was actually pretty powerful. And it seems like she has been able to rise above that. But if you even look stuff at like, you know, the cast of Star Wars, like the original trilogy, and how much their lives outside of like Ford, who managed to become a mainstream actor, a lot of the rest of them had to struggle with having the weight of like, they were these characters and people forever thought of them as just these characters. Yeah, it's a lot to carry and a lot to deal with, and a lot of fodder for interesting story. Again, if we can figure out how to tell those stories ethically.
It's so amazing because like on this end of the spectrum, I would be like, God, if I would be so happy to be a one-hit wonder. Like I would be so happy to like, you know, like have the one thing that like adheres itself genetically to my kind of cultural existence. We would be so lucky to have that one thing, but that, you know, it's a blessing and a curse. Right.
I think also like you were talking about, you know, touching base on the podcast, because we see these days, you know, true crime podcasts are enormous. And people are really, really into them as both informative experiences, but really as entertainment. And, even down to things like, I mean, there's a podcast called like My Favorite Murder, which is kind of a comedy show. And I cannot make myself engage with that or with other podcasts in that kind of genre where there's a few that have been very popular in true crime where the hosts themselves have sort of interjected themselves in the story. You know, like they've become entangled in it in some way. A lot of times it's people who got into it without a real understanding of what journalism was. And so they just hopped in with both feet and then tried to make themselves the hero of the story. It's kind of gross and it's kind of messed up. And they end up touching a lot of people's lives that they should have never come in contact with if they had done these things ethically. So I thought that was a really good angle for this story as well, to kind of, you know, look at what does it mean to have your own obsession with these things and to try to explore and shed light and to eventually get yourself tangled up in it, you know, because you've stared too long into the abyss and maybe you don't recognize that you've overstepped your own boundaries.
I mean, it's amazing because, I mean, even pre-podcasting, like I think of documentary filmmaking as a kind of antecedent to it, like a earlier version of podcasting where like you saw the rise of Michael Moore or Super Size Me, or even one of my personal favorites is this documentary called American Movie, which if you've not seen it, I think it came out in 99, and it's an amazing, amazing film all about a independent filmmaker in Milwaukee trying his damnedest to like make his horror movie. He wants to make a feature, but he can't get it off its feet. So he like goes back to this early short film that he's always wanted to make. But you realize that like he himself as a kind of character now, he's no longer this human being as much as he is evolved into this character that this documentary has kind of presented to the world. And I think that podcasting runs the risk of kind of blurring the line between journalism, bringing something to light or telling the truth of something, or versus like dipping your toe in the puddle and getting your feet a little dirty, you know? And I think that like it muddies the waters to such an extent that like anybody with a microphone can become a journalist. That's a very kind of you know, turgid kind of notion if you think about it. And just because I have the best intentions doesn't necessarily mean I have the right to tell these stories or kind of insert myself into the narrative, which is why I think with part 4, you have a podcaster who has kind of made a mark as somebody who's kind of exposed these urban legends for what they really are, or getting back to the truth of what these kind of ghost stories were before they became ghost stories or urban legends. And I think sometimes it's better to leave good enough alone, you know?
We're not good at doing that as a people. It's not really how we're made, right?
No, but I mean, it's the forbidden fruit, you know? Our stories would be pretty boring if we left good enough alone. Like, I think that it's like, you gotta open up Pandora's box. It's human nature.
Mm-hmm. Again, it's like I said about the character, like even as she gets involved in these things over and over again, there's a certain inevitability where once it's presented in front of you, some people have that ability to say, nope, not doing that again. But it's real hard. This is very, very hard. We've talked about the structure of this is very different from your average novel. How do you manage that from a writing process? Like, how did you outline or put this together? And did you have a specific plotting method? Like, because again, structurally very different from most.
Yeah. Well, two things come to mind. And one of them, in cinematic terms, I wanted to think of the book at large as an anthology feature. So, you have films like Creepshow or Tales from the Dark Side or Tales from the Crypt, the film versions, not the TV versions. But what's interesting is that they are a collection of shorter films that somehow either link together thematically or with some kind of wraparound story. And in my mind, I wanted to, on a certain level, kind of a surface level, approach this as if it were an anthology feature where there's something that kind of drifts from story to story to story. And that is the story of the Little Witch Girl of Pilot's Creek. And you see that she kind of influences and informs and enhances the experience of each particular section. So I went in saying like, all right, this is an anthology feature. How would you write the novelized version of an anthology? So that was that. And then beyond that, in going into each section, I knew where they were going to end. Particularly in my mind, if I'm going to be completely frank, it's all about sections 2 and 3, structurally speaking. Part 1 was always, I almost think of that as the kind of title track of the album. Like that'll be the radio hit. But then parts 2 and 3 are really the kind of foundation of the book itself. And I'm not going to get too spoilery here. I'm not going to give away too much. But I knew going in, they had to, in essence, mirror one another. That like the kind of climax of both had to hinge upon a very specific concept. And it was just a matter of kind of everything kind of building up to that moment. I knew going in that wherever I started, it had to end at this kind of climactic beat multiplied by 2. And that beat in part 1 would be reflected or echoed in part 2, but in a very kind of almost reversed engineered kind of way. And then that section 4 would be, I guess you could say, the kind of fallout. In a weird way, I think of part 4 as a kind of denouement, just the kind of residual falling action of where we leave things in part 3, but with a very own kind of specific intent and story behind it. So yeah, I outlined to the extent where it was like, here's my target for part 2, here's my target for part 3. Now let me kind of build off of that. And let me think of part 1 and part 4 as kind of bookends to those 2 sections. So it's very schematic and very, like, not even getting into the kind of essence or the tone of each of the pieces, but knowing that, like, structurally it had to feel like parts 2 and 3 were the kind of the meat, and that 1 and 4 were the bread.
Since you're building it kind of anthology-wise, and each one of these sections almost kinds of, like you said, I mean, it almost feels like several different movies kind of attached. For each of those individual sections, then, did you think about it from the standpoint of, oh, here's a 3 or 4 act structure? I mean, clearly there's 4 acts to the overall story in the way it's broken down per sections, but then in each individual one, were you ever thinking, oh, here's the beats I need to hit? Or do you write them more short story-ish where they just kind of flowed?
Part 1 was definitely a short story because it is a short story. It's just a ghost story. Parts 2 and 3 were interesting because I almost thinking of it in more kind of symphonic terms, or maybe roller coaster is a more apt metaphor, where like I wanted it to be all about build, escalation, build. You almost think of it like a groundswell of like everything is kind of building up, and like sustaining one kind of note of like to get to like the crest of the roller coaster, and then it's like whoosh, and then it's off, and it's like that kind of build up was something that I wanted. The kind of however far back the story starts, like I know that this is all leading towards that one roller coaster moment where it's like the thing suddenly gets to the top of the roller coaster and then whoosh, and then you're off. And I really wanted the structure and the kind of the flow of the book to kind of replicate that. So, and I just wanted it to be spooky. The jury is out, how scary the book is, but I just thought of these two beats and like wanting to kind of like hang the rest of the narrative around them.
And then what did you use as your writing tools while constructing it? Like what software or what analog stuff?
Well, I'm a Word kind of guy. Like I have my laptop, but like my note taking is terribly analog. It's completely beta. Like I have just a morass of Post-it notes and like I love taking an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, folding it in half, and then like using that half sheet kind of flipped to one side and just like taking little notes. And like I have my notebook and like the novel itself is kind of getting assembled all around the laptop. It's in the kind of writing of it that I'm in front of my computer. Because a lot of it is in first person, I'm talking out loud as I write it. Like it has to read in a certain way to me. I think there's a certain kind of cadence to the text that is quite repetitious by design to feel almost like an incantation or kind of like there's a rhythm to it that almost like if you were to read it out loud, you could feel the kind of impulses or the beats kind of pushing you and propelling you further.
Well, you mentioned the Poe influence earlier, and I think in the third section that is definitely on display.
Oh my God!
Yeah, that sort of circular lyricism.
211.
Yeah. Obviously, we've touched on a lot of the things that were clearly influences for this story. But now that you're past this and going on to other things, what other story and media are you actually feeding your brain with now?
I just lucked out because like within the last couple of weeks, I've read back to back 2 really amazing books. And one of them is called The Law of the Skies. It's a French novel, and I'm going to murder the author's name. Yeah, I think it's Gregory Courtois. But that book to me, The Laws of the Skies, is so brutal. I can't recommend it because it's like a defiant line in the sand for anybody who picks it up. But I was blown away by it. It really affected me. And then after that, I read this other book called Wilder Girls by Rory Power. And it was just such a beautiful, it's kind of like Annihilation for the boarding school girl set. So that's a terrible, terrible reduction of it. And I'm going to go to hell for it. But that was the first thing that came to my mind. So forgive me, Rory Power, for defaming your book. But yeah, I have 2 sons, and as soon as they're in bed, we get to kind of watch film or TV until we drift off to sleep ourselves. But I just saw Parasite, which was phenomenal. I don't know if you've heard of it, but Parasite by Joon-ho Bong co-wrote and directed it. He did The Host, Snowpiercer.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's an amazing movie. I think it comes out in October, and I totally recommend Parasite. So, yeah.
And like I said at the top, the remaking arrives October 8th from Quirk Books. Where should people be following you so they can keep up with everything that you have done and will do going forward?
I'm on Twitter. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. You can find me at Clay McLeod on Instagram, and I think also for Twitter. But yeah, Clay McLeod Chapman is my name. And, if a good Google search will kind of lead you to all the kind of social media isms out there. But yeah, it'd be great to keep in touch.
Well, Clay, this has been an excellent chat. The Remaking is definitely a thought-provoking, maybe challenging isn't the right word, because it's actually, it's an easy read. I think that like it moves fast and keeps you engaged, but it has a lot to say. And I think that it will surprise a lot of people going in that it is more than just a ghost story, but is, really a provocative look at the nature of how we consume stories, relate to them, and the people who are a part of them. So there's a lot to chew on there, which I think is really awesome. So, like I said, it arrives on October 8th. And yeah, thank you for joining me on Fictitious.
Oh man, thank you so much for having me.
This has been Season 4, Episode 12 of Fictitious. Every episode of the show is available at fictitiouspodcast.com, along with news and events, articles, and more. Listen and subscribe to Fictitious on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify, or search for the show using your favorite app. Get connected on Twitter or Instagram, where you'll find us as @FictitiousPod. You can also chat with me directly on my personal account, @AdrianBusky. If you enjoy Fictitious, please share this episode on your favorite social network, tell your book-loving friends, or write us a review. It all supports the authors who appear on the show, and you'll help me to grow the podcast. Next week, I'm joined by Madeline Rue, author of the horror sci-fi thriller Salvaged. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. I'm Adrian Busky. Thanks for listening to Fictitious.